On July 20th, 1993, Donald Wyman was clearing a field near Puxatawny, Pennsylvania, as he was working for his mining company. As he was working, a tree rolled onto his shin, breaking his leg and pinning him to the ground. He shouted for an hour. There was no one who answered, and he concluded that the only way he was going to be able to save his life is to cut off his leg. And so he took a shoestring and used it as a tourniquet. He tightened it with a wrench. And then he took out his pocket knife, and just below the knee, he cut through the skin and the muscle and through the bone and separated the leg, and thereby he was set free. From there, he crawled on his hands and knees, or hand and knee, to a bulldozer. He got in the bulldozer. He drove it for a quarter of a mile to his pickup truck. He was able to maneuver the manual transmission of the pickup truck with his good leg in his hand. He drove 3 miles, and there he finally arrived at a farm where a man named John Huber Jr. rushed him to a hospital where his life was saved. Let me ask you this. What would it take for you to cut off your leg? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us to gouge out our eye if necessary to overcome lust. We're going to look today at some of the most startling words of Jesus. It's Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. Today, the deadly sin of lust. Beginning with verse 27 of Matthew chapter 5, we read, "You have heard it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Well, let me just say 3 things preliminarily. And first of all, it is obvious that Jesus did not mean for us to take this particular instruction literally. If you think about it, even if you followed exactly what Jesus said and you gouged out your right eye, you would still have your left eye for looking at XXX videos. So God has something far more radical in mind than simply mutilating oneself. The second thing to keep in mind is that sex is and lust can be a good thing. In fact, there's an entire book of the Bible, Song of Solomon, that is devoted to the love poetry of a young couple who are admiring one another's bodies. We are not prudes as Christians. Is it a sin for us to admire the attractiveness and beauty of someone of the opposite sex? Well, men, it can be dangerous to your health. If you're walking through the mall and your wife says to you, "Do you think she's pretty?" What you say next is very important. You might want to say, "Some men might think so." And then, of course, it goes both ways, women as well. So it cuts both ways. There are some people who are just plain flat out attractive. And then, thirdly, lust is not a bad word. In the Greek, it simply means strong desire. And as a matter of fact, Jesus at the Lord's Supper says to his disciples, "I have strongly desired for us to eat this supper together. I have lusted for this supper to take place with us together around this table." God wants us to have strong desires. He even wants us to have strong sexual desires. So then, what is the problem? Well, the tense of this verb gives us one hint, and that is it is a participle, lusting. Perhaps Jesus is talking about leering in a sustained way at a person of the opposite sex. When in my heart and mind I seek to control another person for my selfish ends. When I treat a child of God as my own tawdry plaything. It's also interesting that Jesus mentions the word adultery. It may be that Jesus is mostly focused on unfaithful lusting by married people toward other people. And so this is what he calls adultery of the heart. I got to tell you, and I'm sure you're aware, we're not winning this battle in our society. Someone has said that Satan is like a burglar running through the corridors of a hotel, trying all the doors, and the 7 deadly sins are the doors that we leave open most often. And I think when it comes to this one, sometimes we prop the door open and put an arrow that says, "Come on in." After all, it seems so harmless. Hey, if you got it, flaunt it. As some of my buddies back in the 60s, when I was this straight arrow Bible study student there on campus, some of my buddies would taunt me by pointing at a girl and saying, "Hey, Pence, God made that." After all, it seems so harmless. So what's the big deal about lust? I will tell you. And that is this. You talk about getting played. Lust delivers the exact opposite of what it promises. Here is the gift of God's giving us great, strong desire for the purpose of intimacy. And in the end, lust leaves us feeling empty, isolated, and yes, even more and more today, addicted. There's a book that's getting a lot of buzz and play around right now, and it is by a Stanford psychologist, researcher by the name of Philip Zimbardo, and it's called The Demise of Guys. And it begins with a question. Dr. Zimbardo asks, is the overuse of video games and pervasiveness of online porn causing the demise of guys? He goes on to say that online porn is, quote, creating a generation of risk-averse guys who are unable and unwilling to navigate the complexities and risks inherent in real-life relationships, school, and employment. Young men are, quote, being digitally rewired in a totally new way that demands constant stimulation. And he closes with a warning, which may be a very good warning for the church, where it says, we are in a national and perhaps global guy disaster mode that needs to be noticed and solutions to advance and fix a totally novel phenomenon. Now notice he's not talking from religion, he's not talking from morality, he's talking simply about mental health. Now what does this look like on the ground? Let me just risk just giving a little spotlight. Just suppose, let's call him Ken, as a freshman away at college. And it's not going real well. I mean, there are a lot of guys who come walking through the room, but it's not to see Ken, it's to see his life of the party roommate. And so Ken is kind of an outcast. He's alone a lot. He sits in that room. He's got a lot of time on his hands. And there he is, lonely and alone. But you know, just a few clicks away on his computer are these exciting images that give him a rush, that take the edge off his loneliness, that ease the pain of his being a social outcast. And it's so exciting to have women who make no demands on him as he lives out his power fantasies. And so there he lives with, after a while, these unclothed images become his faithful friends. I have to tell you, I have talked with young women who tell me that they run across guys who have been in a very disturbing place inside their minds by traveling on the internet, and it has nothing to do with a real girl. And so you see what I'm saying is how lust, it has a way of taking this wonderful gift God gave us with this urgent, great, strong desire for intimacy and overcoming aloneness, and it just turns it upside down and makes you feel more alone, more empty, and more frustrated than ever. Of the 7 deadly sins, this has got to be the one that's most difficult, particularly for males. I used in my column the image today, this last week, the image of standing at the free throw line in a basketball game. The score is tied, and it's at the very last few seconds of the game, and you're on your opponent's court, and you look up at the standard, and it's God's standard is so high you're not sure you can make it, and everybody around you is trying to make you miss, and they're waving their arms, and they're banging on their noisemakers, and they're blowing their kazoos, just hoping that you'll miss. And the actual fact is that very often there are days when we do miss. We shoot an air ball. We don't hit the standard. But I'm here to tell you that God is still cheering for you. And God will always be there to give us another shot. So what we need today is not a sexual revolution. We need God's sexual revelation. And that's what I'd like to discuss. 2 questions today. And that is, the first one is, what is the purpose of our sexuality? And second, how do we keep our focus, and how do we hit the target that God has for us? First of all, what is the purpose of human sexuality? There are two purposes, and the first one is that surging drive that God has put into us is part of his power sharing project. You and I are stewards. We have been given dominion, and we look at Adam in the garden, and what does Adam do? Adam has the privilege of naming the animals. He says, that's an orangutan, that's a hippo. Today we say that's a virus. And that's a wonderful power that God has given us. But it's nothing next to the next thing he does. He gave Adam and Eve an act whereby humans create other humans. You and I get to create the next coming generations. We get to make a permanent impact on human history. And with every power that we're given in Scripture, there is always a corresponding responsibility that goes with that power. So when a man and a woman engage in that act that God has given us, they must take responsibility for the possibility of the life that might result. There's a good example of this just in everyday life. When you're driving a car, there are 4 spots basically in a vehicle. And of course there's the driver and where the driver sits, and then there is the front seat passenger, we call it shotgun, and then there are the 2 people in the back. And I think you'll probably agree that the 2 people in the back have less responsibility in that car than does the driver. And having a little more responsibility than the people in the back is the one who is riding shotgun, because they may have to pull out a map, or they may have to punch in some GPS numbers, or if the driver's getting sleepy, they may have to keep the driver awake. But when a police officer pulls that car over, does the police officer go to one of the back windows and knock on the window and say, "May I see your driver's license?" Of course not. It's the driver who has the power to push down the accelerator and decide how fast that car is going, and can turn which way or that way in order to be able to take it whichever way they want. With that power, there is a corresponding responsibility. That's the only way life works. It's the way things work. And the corresponding responsibility that goes with the act of sex is one's whole life till death do us part. We were not made for multiple sexual partners, and if we engage in those kinds of behaviors, our bodies have a way of getting even with us, with diseases, unwanted pregnancies, and the results of terminating pregnancies, and other things as well. So what is lust? Lust is grabbing the privilege without having any thought of the responsibility. Now, the number 2 reason why God has given us this gift of human sexuality is so wonderful. In it, God gives us a dim, distant glimmer of the Trinity itself. Think about that. For in the same way that God is in perpetual communion with himself as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, God has given us a way of bonding with another human being in a permanent union, which we call marriage. I just love the way that the Book of Common Prayer used to have its wedding vow. Think of this. In the wedding service, the man and woman would turn to one another before the church, and they would say, "With my body, I thee worship." Isn't that amazing? With my body, I thee worship. And if you think there's such a thing as casual sex, you could not be more wrong. It is to be with a thou whom you worship with your body. That's why God made that desire so strong. It's to cement 2 people for a lifetime. That's why God gave us the gift of sexuality. Now the question is, how do we keep our focus? How do we live the way God wants us to live? Let me mention 3 things. First of all, you've got to admit, the need for grace. There is not a person in this room who does not fail in this area of life. And there is nobody in this room who has any business looking down on anybody else in this room. A lot of times we have this picture that grace is this very rare commodity. You know, maybe you've been hearing that helium is now such a rare commodity that they're predicting that helium balloons may end up costing like $45 each because the helium is sort of becoming so scarce. And a lot of times we treat grace that way. It's like if you're really good, you don't use very much grace. Oh, my friend, I got to tell you that the great saints of the church burn through grace like a 747 on takeoff. And I love the words of the Apostle Paul. He says, he speaks of the inexhaustible riches of God's grace he lavishes on us, his children. Jesus was most kind of all to people who were caught in sexual sin. Remember, they called him a friend of prostitutes. Think of that. And how kind he was to that woman who'd been married 5 times and was caught in the very act of adultery. Of course, Jesus said, now come on, you gotta clean it up, and you gotta live differently. But God has grace for everyone here in this room, inexhaustible, amazing grace for each one of us, more than we could ever need. And so, second, as we go from here, I want to ask us, first of all, grace. Second, guard against what I'm calling lust light. Lust light. What I mean by that is today's obsession to almost worshiping physical attractiveness. There's a wonderful book. It's by Timothy and Kathy Keller, and it's called The Meaning of Marriage. And this is so good, I'm going to read you an entire page from this book. He's speaking to singles, but I'll tell you, as a married person, I learned a lot listening to this. But listen to the wisdom of what he says. It often happens that you have a good friend of the opposite sex with whom you share common understandings. You trust this person's wisdom, and you find you can open up and share many intimate things without fear. He or she understands you well and listens to you and gives you great advice. But the person doesn't attract you romantically. Maybe he or she doesn't have the body type that you find appealing. You feel no sexual chemistry at all. Then imagine that you meet someone else to whom you feel very attracted. This person has the physical and social attributes you've been looking for and is interested in you too. So you start seeing each other and you have a lot of fun together, and things are moving along into more and more romantic intimacy. But if you're honest with yourself, this person you say you are falling in love with does not make nearly as good a friend as the one you already have, nor is that likely to change. You are in trouble. Your spouse has got to be your best friend or be on the way to becoming your best friend, or you won't have a strong, rich marriage that endures, that makes you both vastly better persons for having been in it. I'm not saying you should marry someone when you feel no attraction. The Bible does indicate that your spouse must be more than your dearest friend, but not less. Most of us know that there is some truth in the stereotype that men overvalue beauty in a prospective spouse and women overvalue wealth in a potential mate. But if you marry someone more for these things than for friendship, you are not only setting yourself up for future failure, wealth may and sexual appeal will decrease, but you're also setting yourself up for loneliness. For what Adam in the garden needed was not just a sexual partner, but a companion, bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. If singles accept this principle, it would drastically change the way people seek a marriage partner in our day. And what he's going to describe now almost reminds me of a beer commercial you see on TV. He says, it is typical for a single person to walk into a room and see a number of people of the opposite sex and immediately begin to screen them, not for companionship, but for attractiveness. I call that lust light. Let's say 3 out of the 10 look appealing. The next step is to approach those 3 to see what rapport there may be. If one of them will agree to go on a date and you're romantically involved, well, perhaps you'll see if you can turn that person into a friend as well. The problem is many of your best prospects for friendship were likely among those you ruled out when you walked into the room because they were too tall or too short or too fat or too skinny. We think of the prospective spouse as primarily a lover or a provider, and if he or she can be a friend on top of that, well, isn't that nice? We should be going at it in the other way around. Screen first for friendship. Look for someone who understands you better than you do yourself, who makes you a better person just by being around them. And then explore whether that friendship could become a romance and a marriage. So many people go about their dating starting from the wrong end, and they end up in marriages that aren't really about anything and that are going nowhere. Beware of lust light. Soak up the grace, Beware of lust, light. And then third, be preemptive. Cut lust off at the pass. Let me just share a word on that. One of the big words these days is algorithm in computers and in medicine. And it's a very fancy word, but in my simple mind, it simply many times just means a checklist. It means a step-by-step process by which you have a desired outcome. It used to be the doctors would walk in the room and they'd kind of go by the seat of their pants and they'd use their instincts and they'd make a call. And so what they found is that often they were wrong. And so what an algorithm is something that is a rigorous process, step by step, based on data that they go through, surrendering their instinct to this objective process. Check, 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 check. Believe it or not, I thought about that this summer when I was attending the Al Green concert. And I got to tell you, Al Green, to me, is the ultimate soul singer. I mean, he has still got it, folks. And he just absolutely blew it away. In fact, I'm going to play just a little bit of, listen to this falsetto that he's still got going. Now listen to this now. Okay? See what I'm talking about, okay? The ladies just go crazy for Al Green. And he talked about that. He talked about the sexual temptations that he faces when he is traveling. Do you think Al Green just sort of flies into a city and checks into the Four Seasons and sort of trusts his instincts? Baby, he would be toast if he did that as a Christian. And so when I listened to him, he's got Al Green has an algorithm. And here's how it works, okay? First of all, that great, terrific sounding backup group you heard him singing, you know who those are? Those are his daughters. He never travels without his daughters. And they fly in and they get a suite. So that anytime there's a knock at the door, it's not Al who answers the door because it's going to be some of those ladies. And what happens is one of Al's daughters opens the door and says, "May I help you?" Al Green also said whenever he's on the road and the phone rings in the hotel room, he picks it up and he says, "Hello, Jesus Christ, Lord of my life, Al Green." In other words, you cut lust off at the past. You take the steps ahead of time, the checklist that will keep you out of danger. And baby, if you do that, maybe someday you'll get to that point that he's singing about right there when you look at your loved one, your sweetheart decades from now, and you say, "I'm still in love with you." This is a Presbyterian sermon. I can't end with Al Green. So I'm going to end with John Calvin, okay? Here's what John Calvin says. He says, "Pious souls can derive great confidence and delight that they form one body with Christ so that everything which is his they may call their own. This is the wondrous exchange made by his boundless goodness. Having become with us the Son of Man, he has made us with himself sons of God. By his own descent to earth, he has prepared our ascent to heaven. And having received our mortality, he has bestowed on us his immortality. Having undertaken our weakness, he has made us strong in his strength. Having submitted to our poverty, he has transferred to us his riches. Having taken upon himself the burden of unrighteousness with which we were oppressed, he has clothed us in his righteousness."